Now thrive the armourers. Hello, I'm Guy Wilson, and Liveryman K. Smith and I are your guides through the 700 years of the Armourers and Brasiers Company. After the wars and turbulent times of the 16th century, the reign of King James I, which began in 1603, ushered in some 2 decades of peace. Good for the country, but not so good for a company whose main job was the production of armour and weapons. However, the London armourers got through these lean times with their skills intact, as Tom Richardson, former curator of armour at the Royal Armouries, explains.
The second quarter of the 17th century sees an absolute flowering of the work of the London Armourers Company. Influenced by Dutch prototypes, they produced their own style of armour, which remarkably, at a period when decorated armour is going out of fashion, was decorated, and decorated in a unique way. And the company's hall has remarkable examples in its collection. Another remarkable thing is that the armour produced by the company began in the second quarter of the 17th century to be stamped with a guild mark, the crowned A of the company, so we can for the first time identify the products of the company. And not only that, the individual armourers started to stamp their work and bring it to the hall to be approved. And so we can identify the individual makers, their biographies, their lives, and their works which survive today, which is fantastic.
However, all was not plain sailing for the company. Graham Rymer, formerly curator of firearms at the Royal Armouries, explains.
It's fair to say that through most of the 17th century there was considerable jostling between the Armourers Company and the Blacksmiths Company in particular, although joiners and loriners were also involved to a lesser degree. They sought to avoid the creation of a company dedicated specifically to gunmaking. They naturally wanted to protect the interests of their members and to avoid a breakaway company being established.
But this proved to be impossible.
In 1638, the Gunmakers' Company obtained a charter which sought to create a company dedicated to gunmaking. And although that charter existed and appeared to be substantial, in real terms it made relatively little difference. Gunmakers were still mostly members of the Armourers Company and of the Blacksmiths Company.
During this period, the company was still receiving many gifts of silver from its members. Some are marked with very personal inscriptions, as Angus Patterson, curator at the Victoria and Albert Museum, makes clear.
And some of them are very touching. I was just looking at the Maxfield Cup and the Dixon Cup, one acting as the executor for the other, and then their cup when they have died being presented to the company as well. These are very sort of personal connections. And on the inscriptions they often include the names of their wives as well, so that they are joint gifts to the company, which is also quite a touching and personal thing to read on an inscription.
But soon Britain was at war with itself. Keith Dowan, assistant curator of armour and edged weapons at the Royal Armouries, explains the origins of the conflict.
The Civil War really was the culmination of a long list of grievances that Parliament held against Charles I. The Civil War itself was really about trying to establish the role of the monarchy in a new world in which ordinary people and Parliament believed they should also be part of decision-making process and ruling the country.
These civil wars were, of course, very good for the company. Members were kept busy supplying armour and weapons to the forces. But what were they supplying? Keith Dowan again.
Well, during the Civil War, the infantry and cavalry were divided up into different types. So, for example, you had pikemen, and they would be armed with a morion or caboset helmet, and they probably would have worn, at least at the beginning of the war, some kind of body armour, and so that would have comprised a back and breastplate and also a pair of tassets. They would have been armed with a pike around 16 foot long as their primary weapon and a sword as their secondary weapon.
However, Tom Richardson suggests that as the war progressed, many soldiers did not wear any armour at all.
By the 1640s, although there was plenty of pikemen's armour hanging around in England, the evidence is that mostly regiments of foot weren't wearing it. And that's why so much of it survives in the National Arsenal at the Tower of London, because it just stayed there and never went out.
The cavalry came in two main types. So you had the Armourers. These are the more lightly armed cavalry. They would have worn the famous 3-bar pot, probably a buff coat, at least in some instances, a back and a breastplate, a pair of pistols, and a sword. The other type of cavalry, which was really going out of use in the early Civil War, was the fully armoured cuirassier, and one can think of those really as the descendant of the medieval knight. So they were armed head to knee in plate armour, some of it quite heavy because it was proofed against pistol shot, and they too would have carried a pair of pistols and a sword.
Graham Rymer confirms that armour wearing was in serious decline.
We see a last flowering of the wearing of full armour in the 17th century and during the English Civil Wars with the heavy cavalry, the so-called lobsters. But that was unusual, and the majority of both cavalry and infantry wore less and less armour.
Musketeers, they would have been armed with matchlock muskets primarily, although some specialist units, particularly those guarding artillery trains, would have used an early form of flintlock musket. They wouldn't have worn any armour. In fact, there are numerous commentaries of the late 16th and early 17th century stating that it was completely unnecessary for musketeers to wear armour, even a helmet. But they would have also have carried a sword.
Graham reinforces this point.
There is an interesting illustrated publication called The True Portraiture of the Valiant English Soldiers. And in it there are a series of military figures, beneath which is a short 4-line couplet. And one of them is the musketer, not musketeer, but musketer, who is completely unarmoured in the wonderful image that goes along with it. He's wearing extravagant costume, but not a scrap of armour. And he says, "No sooner shall the enemy pipe, but I will mark him so that he shall gladly on the ground creep that was apt to go. With thundering shot I'll bouge him then, albeit he stand aloof, that nothing shall his corslet help, though it be made of proof." Well, that was an attempt to make it apparent to anybody reading it that the musketeer believes that his musket can, as it were, level somebody wearing even bulletproof armour, the corslet of proof that he talks about.
To pay for its armies, Parliament, which controlled London, raised taxes across the population and city institutions, among them the livery companies, which were heavily taxed. Many sold their plate, a ready source of money, but 2 armourers, Alexander Normington, a swordsmith, and John Pasmer, a brazier, loaned the required amounts to the company, which explains why the armourers still have most of their early pre-Civil War silver.
But where did the opposing forces get their arms, armour and equipment from? Keith Dowan explains.
Well, London was the centre of armour production in this country during the 17th century, and because London fell under parliamentarian control, parliamentarian forces had access to the cutlers, the gunsmiths, and of course the Armourers Company, and they were producing vast quantities of armour throughout the civil wars. Right at the very beginning in 1642, Parliament still relied on foreign imports to supplement what it was able to produce itself, and it wasn't really until the late 1640s that Parliament became self-sufficient. By that I mean that the various London companies were able to produce everything that was required. For the Royalists, the situation was different. They had their capital in Oxford, and they really had to start from scratch. We know that some members of the Royal Armoury at Greenwich left London with the King and went to Oxford, and they established a new ordnance office within the university buildings. They were able to bring in a lot of supplies from around the country and refurbish arms and armour, but they didn't seem to be producing anything. So they were much more reliant on foreign imports.
Many of these imports came from the Netherlands. Keith again.
There's an interesting case with the Dutch armourers, for example, that they were under strict instructions to remain neutral during the war. Of course, they took this to mean that they could supply both sides equally and not favour one or the other.
And it wasn't just the armour makers who benefited from supplying the armies. Graham Rymer.
Some gun makers who had been working in London moved to Oxford to continue supplying the King's forces, but most of them who'd been mostly producing for the ordnance and thus for the parliamentarian forces, since the Tower, which was the principal arsenal of the kingdom, was in their control, and the gun makers were centred around the minories nearby, and they had for decades derived much useful income from their military contracts.
After the civil wars and before the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, Britain was governed by Oliver Cromwell. During this period, the possessions of the king were largely sold off. But a member of the company played an important part in saving one of the great treasures of Charles I's reign. Ruth Brown, an historian and co-author of the recent book on the company's treasures, tells the story.
A bronze equestrian statue of King Charles, made by a famous French sculptor, was bought by John Rivet, a brazier and a member of the company, on the condition that he melted it down. And throughout the Commonwealth, Rivet sold off pieces of the statue, both to royalists, who bought it as a relic of the late king, and to supporters of Parliament, who liked to think they were drinking their beer out of a tankard made from a melted-down effigy of the late king. However, on the restoration of Charles II, Rivet miraculously revealed that the statue was still intact, and you can see it today if you go down to Trafalgar Square, positioned at the top of Whitehall.
Following the restoration of Charles II came a decade of wars on the high seas against the Dutch, and two major disasters, one of which affected the whole country, while the other wrought havoc and chaos for the city of London and its inhabitants.
One of the largest ever outbreaks of plague in England occurred in the summer of 1665. London, with its high population density, was extremely badly affected. Daniel Defoe described the speed with which Londoners were struck down.
As to the suddenness of people's dying at this time, there were innumerable instances of it. One family, without the bars and not far from me, were all seemingly well on the Monday, being 10 in family. That evening, one maid and one apprentice were taken ill and died the next morning, when the other apprentice and 2 children were touched, whereof one died the same evening and the other 2 on Wednesday. In a word, by Saturday at noon, the master, mistress, 4 children and 4 servants were all gone.
Armourers and their families suffered along with everyone else, as the records of burials in many churches make clear.
St. Peter's, Cornhill, 22nd of July 1665. John, son of John Rumney, armourer. Pitt in the East Yard, plague. 12th of August, Anne, daughter of John Rumney, armourer. Pitt in the East Yard, plague. 14th of August, Jane, the wife of John Rumney, armourer. Pitt in the East Yard, plague. 18th of August, George, son of John Rumney, armourer. Pitt in the East Yard, plague. 31st of August, John Rumney, armourer. Pitt in the East Yard, plague.
And if that wasn't bad enough, in the following year most of the city of London was destroyed in the Great Fire. Samuel Pepys wrote in his diary,
Walked to St. James's Parks, and there met my wife, and Creed, and Wood, and his wife, and walked to my boat, and there upon the water again, and to the fire, so near the fire as we could for smoke. And all over the Thames, with one's face in the wind, you were almost burned with a shower of fire drops. When we could endure no more upon the water, we to a little alehouse on the bankside, and there stayed till it was dark almost, and saw the fire grow. And as it grew darker, appeared more and more, and in corners and upon steeples, and between churches and houses, as far as we could see, in a most horrid, malicious, bloody flame.
Although virtually the whole of the city was destroyed, Armourers Hall survived, as Roger Bowdler, architectural historian and upper warden, explains.
And the hall, the site of the hall has been blessed. It has been looked over by the good Lord above, because we just managed to escape being reduced to cinders in the miraculous escape from the Great Fire of London of 1666. The glass in the windows was lost. The scorching was obviously that intense and that close to the hall, but the actual building survived. We got away with it, and that was going to happen again in the Second World War.
But the fire destroyed the homes and workshops of many of the armourers who lived and worked within the city.
Although the company's halls survived the fire, many of its properties, as well as the homes and workshops of its members, were destroyed, and as property insurance was almost unheard of at this time, the company had to pay for rebuilding work out of its own resources. The final decades of the century were a time of deep financial austerity when the company had to curtail a lot of its expenditure. And to add further misery, this period coincided with the almost complete demise of armour wearing, another consequence of the civil wars, as Keith Dowan explains.
Ultimately, though, I think the Civil War did hasten the end of wearing armour on the battlefield, although in some respects, particularly for the cavalry, it did linger on until the end of the century. But the Civil Wars really taught us the power of the firearm on the battlefield, the need for manoeuvrability, to adapt quickly to changing circumstances and to fight over different terrains, that really armour was no longer suitable to do that.
The era of armour had come to an end, and it was at this time that the last royal armour was made in London.
One of the almost the last working armourers in the company was Richard Holden, or Holden, who made 2 armours for James II in 1685. And they were the latest fashion of harquebus armour with a reinforcing breastplate, so 2 breastplates stapled together with a bullet mark and a bulletproof back and a bulletproof harquebusier's pot.
However, as we've already explained, some armourers had a second string to their bow, and it is from the latter years of the century that members of the company turned increasingly to other trades, particularly working on copper and brass, the Brasiers trade, which will come to dominate the company over the next century, as we shall hear next time.
Next time, the company changes direction in an age of increasing enlightenment and elegance. This has been a Past Master production for Basilisco Press. Our thanks to Roger Bowdler, Ruth Brown, Keith Dowan, Angus Patterson, Tom Richardson and Graham Reimer.